In this chapter, we're looking at probably one of the primary reasons why governments get involved in the first place in our daily lives, and that comes down to externalities. Now, just to kind of review for us here, if we go back to our principles class, an externality, there are two types, negative and positive, but their existence suggests um, that there's a difference between what one captures privately versus what exists for society. So, to review for us here, is that typically when we're looking at, so I'm going to draw here. I'm going to be able to draw. Right, so that typically when we're dealing with positive externalities, the idea is that the social benefits exceed the private benefits. Now, people don't act with society in mind, they act with their own private concerns in mind. And so, in this case here, if people did things only until their private benefits were satisfied, the problem would be is that it's underconsumed. As an example, let's say that I live in a really shitty house, right? And I rent it, okay? So I rent a really shitty apartment. I have nothing, I have absolutely nothing to my name in terms of possessions. I've got some like old, dirty clothes, and that's it, right? Pretty simple existence. And so if you were to say to me, hey, Shiting, why don't you buy a smoke detector so that if your house catches on fire, the apartment catches on fire, we'll know what's going on, and then we'll be able to escape. Be like, dude, I don't own anything great, so there's not a lot of benefits to me having a smoke detector. I don't own the house. I don't own the apartment. I don't have very much good stuff in my apartment, so I don't really care. But the fact of the matter is that the rest of society cares a lot, and they benefit a lot. So, what would this be designed to do, right? We'd have to create a program to first um, take note of the fact that there are positive externalities to having a smoke detector, to having a 911 system, to having a fire department. And then we would talk about how are we going to make sure that enough of that happens. So in the case of the 911 system and the fire department, typically the government is the one that provides those things, and they make sure to provide enough to reflect the social benefit. Now, smoke detectors, those aren't made by the government. But on the other hand, I'm really looking at this up for the first time, so I have no idea if what I'm going to find here is true. But I'm hoping. Well, let's see. Here we go. So actually, my second son is deaf, and it's a problem. It's a problem. Not that he's deaf. It's a problem for smoke detectors, right? Because smoke detectors make sound, but when he's sleeping, or even when he's awake, he can't hear. So, like, how would you have to do this, right? Is that you have to have it be doing other things like flashing, shaking the bed, in order to wake the person up. So in this case here, the city of Portland at least got a grant from the federal government in order to put smoke detectors in homes for those who are deaf and hard of hearing. Now, what I was actually looking for here was something else here. And we got one here for the Cascades region. So for here, we've got free smoke detectors, for basically people who, you don't have to say I'm poor and I don't have one, but for whatever reason, the person doesn't have one, and all the person would have to do is click here, and they'll give you the smoke detector, and they'll put it in your house. Why are they doing that? Well, as most of this kind of all says here, is that it's improving the safety of their lives, obviously, but also those of their their community. all part of a positive externality. Now, what about the other side of this? The negative externality. This would be one where the social cost exceeds the private cost. And the problem here is the opposite problem. It's overproduced. So as an example of this, actually being here in Hawaii, it's actually the first time I've actually ever lived in a state where I didn't have to have emissions testing on my car every year. And for a person who doesn't drive a very nice car, it's actually pretty nice to not have to worry about that. Because it wasn't always the case that my car would pass emissions testing. And what was the point of that emissions testing? It's like I drive an older car. My car's a little bit less efficient. It uses a little bit more gas, and that gas probably just gets spit out, the tailpipe. Do I care? It costs me a little bit more, but the cost to fix it would be a lot more. So I'm not going to bother fixing it. Well, that's a problem for the rest of society, though, right? Because I'm causing a lot of pollution. I'm using up, gas more than I should be. Typically, in communities, we control for that by ensuring that people don't do too much of a thing that causes a negative externality. So in this case, it would be that people have to either buy a better car or get their car fixed so that it's not creating too much pollution. Or in other ways that we do it is that we ban the good. So that would be, for instance, that we don't let little kids smoke. Why don't we let little kids smoke? That's a bad habit, and kids don't exactly know yet the way in which they kind of can scale back overdoing something. And right, there's all these health problems that are caused by smoking. Whole bunch of things that we stop people from doing things up until a certain point in time, and then we let them make bad decisions. Okay, so let's. We've got some other examples here, which I think will be pretty obvious now after having talked about this a little bit here. Global warming being a big one, right? Is that we each individually, in the things that we do, right? Leaving a computer on, driving, one person in the car to a distance, quite some distance, flying. All these things contribute to global warming, yet individually, it'd be a pain in the butt to not, to have to ride the bus or to not go to a conference and fly somewhere. I mean, I live in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It uses a lot of fossil fuels to bring everything here. Even the way we produce electricity here is that we burn oil, we literally burn oil to make electric here. We should be using less electric, I guess. But again, the issue is that individually, I behave on an individual basis, yet there are true social costs to what's happening. And so we can see this here, right? Is that the temperature, well, certainly since industrialization, but really when we've gotten to a more oil-fueled industrialization of the entire world, is that the global temperature has gone up. Now, it's obviously a little bit controversial, right? Because we don't really, we have scientists who say that there is a causal relationship between the two. But then personally, I don't care what your personal belief is. But there are those out there who deny global warming and its connection to emissions created by the burning of fossil fuels. I'm not smart enough in this area to even tell you who's right or wrong. What I can tell you with some certainty is that if there is an externality to something, it generally means that the government needs to get involved in some way. As offensive as it might be to some, once you identify an externality, you almost always have the government get involved because of the market failure. The only way around this would be something like the Coase theorem, but that only applies in very limited circumstances. Most of the time, we have to do something where um, most of the time we have to do something where we try to control for the market failure with government intervention, either by subsidizing the product, taxing the product, or directly producing the product itself. Markets don't deal well with externalities, which is in some case why global warming is such a difficult thing for us as a society to deal with, because there is no market solution to it. And we love markets. So it's hard to just say, let the market figure it out. The market will not figure it out. So all these initiatives we have right now, right? You pick any big company. I'm just going to pick one. Really big one, General Motors, right? They make cars. Cars, generally speaking, aren't good for the environment. Let's just type it in. I'm not even sure what I'm going to find here. There we go. So global products and operations they're going to try to be carbon neutral by 2040 and eliminate tailpipe emissions from new light duty vehicles by 2035. Dude, that's going to be incredibly difficult to do. And I don't see how they do it. So yeah, you can eliminate tailpipe emissions, but that would mean then you have cars running on electric, which just means that you're generating the electric in other ways that destroy the environment. How do you make our products and operations carbon neutral? Well, usually what they have to do, right, is that you still have steel and plastic and cushions and all those things into cars, and those create carbons, right? The production of them creates carbons. Well, then what they have to do is usually what they do is they plant trees to offset it. But even all those estimates we have of the trees is very different. And there was this funny, only because I'm thinking of it here. It was this really funny video about a year ago. You'd have to watch it for 20 minutes, and we're not going to watch it here. But John Oliver does a really funny one with carbon offsets that talks about. Obviously, it's critical of this market-driven way of dealing with an externality. And this isn't political. Let's just be upfront here. It's not that I think that global warming exists or that I deny that it exists. That's not the case. But my criticism is, as an economist, and this one I can stand thoroughly behind, is that you can't have a market failure without government intervention unless you apply the Coase theorem. But the Coase theorem in this case cannot be used in the example of global warming. What is the Coase theorem? Well, we'll talk about it in a bit, but the Coase theorem, named after Ronald Coase at the University of Chicago, he was against government intervention. The University of Chicago, they really like markets a lot. And so he would be troubled by a statement like mine that I just said, that when the market fails, you have to have the government exist. What Coase said was you don't have to have the government providing the good or restricting the good. Instead, what you need to have is a clear statement of rights and an enforcement of those rights, and then allocate the rights to one party. So it'd be like if two people are fighting over a piece of land, then you say that in general, someone can own land, someone can sell the land that they own, party A, you own the land. Well then, right, people can just negotiate and buy the land from the other person. And everyone has a price, right? But in this case, you can't have in global warming, this doesn't exactly apply, because we don't even know who has the right to do what. Do we have a right to burn fossil fuels? Do we have a right to clean air? Who would define that right? Who would enforce that right? None of those things exist. Which then means that the only solution to this is government intervention in some way, which of course bothers some. So we can have these externalities exist on the production side as well as the consumption side. And when they exist on the production side, again, we're talking about things that we typically would understand, like emissions from cars. Um, Here they've got like pollution from steel production, pollution that's dumped in a river, um, and that hurts society. I drive my car; it creates pollution that causes, asthma. Um, but then there are other times as well where there's an externality that's negative, but it's caused because I consume a good. So here, that one would be like if I smoke in a restaurant, then obviously I'm affecting others. And this is one obviously where we restrict a lot of smoking in restaurants and bars exactly because of this negative consumption externality. Um, we also do this here in Hawaii. We do this one with plastics. We don't give people straws. Straws can't be plastic. Utensils are not given. They're plastic. And if you wear suntan lotion, it has to be like reef friendly so that the suntan lotion doesn't destroy the reefs. These are all things that the act of consuming that particular good causes a negative consequence for others. And again, there's our difference. There's just a fundamental difference between that private cost and the social cost. Again, in the case of the negative externality, sorry, am I trying this out here? Let's see here. It doesn't want me to draw. Sorry. Again, in the case of the negative externality, this would be one where the social marginal cost exceeds the private marginal cost. And again, the problem here is that it's overproduced. Or, on the other hand, it's overconsumed, right? Depending on what type of externality we're talking about. How do we see that, right? So in this case, it would be that private companies pollute much more if they don't face the costs of their pollution. People smoke more if, right, they're drinking and they, when people drink, they like to smoke, right? And so if there's no restriction to them smoking, then they're just going to smoke more in the bar, causing all these externalities, costs for others. So we need to somehow control for this. Again, the question is how. What we also see, again, with this negative consumption externality, again, is that difference between um, the marginal benefit in from the private for the private person versus the social marginal benefit. In this case, the social marginal benefit is less than the private marginal benefit. And so the problem here is that people smoke more, causing this cost on others. So, how do we control this? Again, it comes down to the government getting involved to fix this market failure. In an efficient, market driven situation, we don't generally talk about this because these two are already the same by their very definition. But what we know, right, and we find this, we get to this point by the equilibrium. The problem, and this is where it all comes down to, markets don't generally work in this case. And again, the reason why markets don't work is because there's a difference between the two. In a limited situation like the Coase theorem, you can find a situation where you bridge that gap between the two. But most of the time, you're stuck with not being able to bridge the gap between the two. And so there, then restating, the difference is what they're calling the MD, the marginal damage, which is a pretty handy term here. So we need to do two things. We need to designate, indicate that there is this damage being done, and then we need to measure how much damage is being done so that we can then account for it. In this case, for the negative production externality, the problem here is that the social marginal cost is less than the private marginal cost, so we need to add a damage component to it. With the consumption externality, we need to add the damage, not add, but we need to incorporate a damage component to the private benefits to kind of detract from those private benefits so that it matches the social. Okay, now, the way that we can understand this graphically is that there's then a difference in the supply curves, for instance, most of the time when we're talking about the negative production externalities. And what we see here is that the supply curve is to the left of the private curve, because essentially what the damage component does is it adds the cost. It shifts the supply curve to the left. And thus what we can see is that when it intersects with the private benefit curve and the social benefit curve, the demand curve, we basically, if we don't control for the externality, we have too much produced. We need to artificially make this good more expensive. The only way we pretty much know how to make something more expensive is if we tax it, which is generally what we do. So if we added a tax would shift the supply curve. A tax would generally shift the supply curve to the left. And thus what it would cause is it would cause our equilibrium point to move to the left. And it would move just enough so that we have our efficient amount produced. And it would remove the deadweight loss that exists. This is what I always find so shocking. I always find, and this is me, it's partly sharing my personal beliefs, so this is not, this is not like officially sanctioned economic theory. But what bothers me a bit about any of these conversations about pollution or name your favorite externality is that people start off this belief either saying, the belief saying that the government can't be the solution to this and that markets work. But they don't always. In this case, having the market exist where it's creating consistently this negative externality, it's creating a deadweight loss. The height of the deadweight loss, right, for an area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. If there's no height to the triangle, right, and this would be our height, if there's no height to the triangle, it has no area. Meaning that the height of the triangle is determined by the amount of the overproduction of the good that has a negative externality. To the extent that we make it more expensive to do something that creates a negative externality, we reduce the height, thus reducing the overproduction of that good. And if we do it right, we can get down to zero. And so that's what we then start to see here, right? We can look at this when we look at this in terms of, when we look at this in terms of the SUVs, we could see that they don't get very good gas mileage and they cause more wear and tear on the roads. And when SUVs hit things, they usually hurt the people on the other side. So, with that said, we then generally find ourselves in a situation where we don't want people driving SUVs because of the negative externalities they produce. Let me just pause here for a second. So, the solution to this, now this is something, it makes me sound like I work for, I do work for the state of Hawaii, but I'm not trying to sell what Hawaii does is determined long before I came on the scene. But this would be why many states, for car registration purposes, uses a weight tax, vehicle weight tax. So I drive a Toyota Yaris, which is an incredibly light vehicle, weighs about 2,300 pounds. And so my registration then is less expensive than those who drive an SUV. An SUV, they are both paying more in gasoline taxes, but they're also paying more in registration taxes to reflect both the wear and tear on roads and the various safety externalities. The only problem we start to get into here is what happens when those SUVs don't use as much gas because they're electric or they're hybrid, which is now what's causing this whole kind of problem where there's like an environmental or an electric car fee being added. Not sure. Yeah, you have to pay looks like here you have to pay $115 annually if you use an electric car. Or, this is interesting, or you can pay 19 cents a mile if you kind of track your miles. Interesting. Very interesting. Road use fee. Interesting that Oregon uses that because, look at that, wear and tear on roads. So 19 cents a mile to kind of reflect that extra added cost of the car wearing down the road. So interestingly, the gasoline tax, when it was passed in the 1950s and we were building the interstates, cars weren't that efficient. So they were using a lot of gas and people were paying enough in gasoline taxes to build the interstate system. Now that cars are more fuel efficient, the problem is that they're paying less in gas taxes, which now means that all our roads and bridges aren't getting enough money to be built. So that's kind of one of the reasons why almost all states have a pretty bad road infrastructure system because they're quite simply not getting the revenue that they used to have for these heavier cars that are driving on them. Now, the other side of this would be is that we can look at this from a positive production, a positive externality perspective. Again, I gave you an example of where consuming the good benefits others. That was my example of the smoke detector. But we can also have positive production externalities as well. This is actually where my dissertation research was. So my dissertation research, to get my PhD, you write a doctoral thesis, and my doctoral thesis was on. It sounds a little bit odd when I say it, so let me try to simplify it. My research was on scholarly journals, journal articles that are written by academics like myself. There is both a benefit to the individual that writes the article, right? Because I would need that for promotion, for getting a job, those kinds of things. But it obviously also benefits others because research builds on the findings of others, right? So in this case, there is a production externality. Now the question is, how do you extract it, right? So my dissertation research was a little bit on different ways that the government could subsidize the production of journal articles or journals, academic journals, to be able to encourage or find enough space for these journal articles to exist because of the positive externalities they create. It was actually pretty well read as a dissertation article. It got published in a pretty prominent journal. Not to boast or anything, but pretty big deal. So now the problem is the opposite of what we had for the negative externality. Now the issue is that because of these externalities that exist, the supply curve would be to the right of the original supply curve. So we typically would compensate that by the opposite of a tax, which is a subsidy. Now, to the extent that we don't have that subsidy, then the thing tends to be underproduced. So just as my research showed that there weren't enough academic journals out there to publish everything that everybody was producing, again, if people have to pay privately for something like a smoke detector, there quite simply won't be enough of them out there. So we need to try to find some way now to get the funding to get people smoke detectors that don't have them. Just as there's this whole other, it applies in a slightly different way, but we're seeing this right now with feminine hygiene products. For feminine hygiene products, right, it obviously is a cost only paid for by women, obviously, and right, and we tax those goods, and right, there's a sales tax on those goods and whatnot. But what does that mean? If there's a sales tax on the good, and these goods, if you go to CVS or Walgreens and you buy it, it has a cost. But on the other hand, I mean, even just from a health perspective, we have to worry about, are people, are women using enough of the product as should be directed, or, right, with various financial constraints and whatnot, are they not being consumed enough? The concern is that they're not being consumed enough. This is from the consumption side, not the production side. They're not being consumed enough. And so we need to try to find ways to encourage their consumption. Otherwise, they'll be underconsumed. So it was interesting because then when actually my wife asked me to get, the products at Walgreens, or no, it was at CVS. When I bought it at CVS, I paid for it and I didn't think too much. But then I saw on the receipt that there was a sales tax imposed, and then CVS actually paid the sales tax on my behalf. It's not a government program, but in some sense it's reflecting this externality that exists in it being underconsumed. It's a pretty good slide here then that summarizes kind of what's going on here. And so I'll just leave this here just to note to you that slide 15 is important. In the issue of balance, the textbook, and as well as myself, will talk about, are there private sector solutions to negative externalities? I mean, there are sometimes, but the difficult part is that you have to find a way to numerically measure the externality. So in this case here, we could say that the fishers have a right to the clean water. So if the steel company is going to pollute the waters, they have to pay the people who fish, to compensate them to give up their right to the clean water that they use for fishing for things. The better example we have of this actually is the way that Tesla makes its money. So what Tesla gets for producing cars, right? It produces all electric cars. Tesla makes a lot of money on carbon credits. I'm trying to see here. Look at that. 2022, Tesla, which makes cars, made $1.78 billion in 2022 selling their carbon credits to other companies that produce things that generate carbons. So in other words, Tesla as a company is, has all these carbon credits for producing these vehicles. Wow, look at that. That's crazy. So because it makes electric cars, it doesn't need the carbon credits because it's not generating cars that create pollution. So there's all these credits to sell to other companies where they do make, to other automakers that obviously are producing cars that pollute more. So they sell. So if you're an automaker and you're making cars that pollute more, you have to buy the credits from a different company that has more than they need. And obviously Tesla has a lot because they make all electric cars. So they're selling those credits and making a lot of money doing it, looks like. Interesting. Well, it goes to show you. Again, very difficult to pull this off. I just gave you probably the best example was the Tesla example of an actual situation where the government has done a pretty good job of internalizing the externality of saying that cars have to meet a certain emission standard, and then saying if you're producing cars that are under that standard, you can sell your excess to other companies. You can do that because there's not a lot of car makers. So you all know who all the people are, right? It's much more difficult to do that with millions of different people. Instead here, we're just looking at a few car companies that are easy to track down. And that's our Coase theorem then. The only way that you can get out of the government being involved in controlling for an externality is that you define the property rights clearly, and then you allow the property holder to go into negotiations to bargain with other parties, right? And they could do that in the courts, or they could just do that, napkin at a bar, and they could be writing down things. And so as long, it doesn't matter who you give the rights to. You could give the rights to people to demand clean air, or you could give the rights to car companies to be able to produce pollution. It doesn't matter what the right is, and it doesn't matter who you give the right to. The idea of the Coase theorem is that people will be able to negotiate things. So if car companies have a right to pollute, then me and my fellow, I don't suffer from asthma, right? But me and fellow asthma sufferers could then go to the car companies and say, we don't want you to pollute as much. We don't want you to make as many cars. We're going to pay you $1 million to not make so many cars, right? And if the price is good enough, they'll stop doing it, right? Or on the other hand, I could have the right to clean air. And GM could come to me and say, hey, I know you suffer from asthma. How much would I have to pay you to be able to suffer from asthma? All right. And I'd be like, at first time I'd say, nothing. I'd never want to do it. Right. But if they say, what if I paid you $1 million? Then maybe I'd be like, you know what? I'll take it, dude. I'll suffer from being short of breath if you paid me $1 million. Everyone's got a price. That's the whole idea of the Coase theorem. And you could just negotiate it. And if you negotiate it enough, you get enough of a Coasean payment. In essence, the negotiation is over this amount, right? So in my example here, it was $1 million. And $1 million shift for the company to now have to pay me out that $1 million. So they're going to make some fewer cars, but I'm going to get the $1 million. And the government was not involved. That's a lot of work. And you have to get it just right. We don't tend to see the Coase theorem used a lot in reality. And it would not be able to be applied to global warming, which is basically the problem that we have right now in humanity is the Coase theorem is not strong enough to fix the problem. What we also see as additional difficulties to the Coase theorem was, again, we do get, it's difficult. It doesn't matter, but it doesn't mean that we still don't talk a lot about who gets that right to do something. Do companies have a right to produce cars, or do we have a right to clean air? And the other problem is, what do you do? What if I agree to the $1 million price and I give up my right to not have to suffer from asthma? But what if my neighbor who also has asthma doesn't agree to any price ever? Right? They're just a Puritan and they won't ever give up that right. Then what are you going to do? Right? So we can have these holdouts that exist. The other problem that tends to occur here when the government's not involved and we don't have the power of taxation is that we get these free rider problems. And the free rider problems are pretty significant. With taxation, they don't exist because if you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. So people do tend to pay their taxes as they should. But instead, what we, with the Coase theorem, you don't really have that existing. So, if people aren't paying enough to get rid of the pollution, the problem is just going to remain as it is. And the bigger thing is that, and this is especially the case for something like global warming, is that there's too many people affected by global warming. Everyone that lives on the globe is affected. So the problem is you can't negotiate with everyone on the globe. The transaction costs are too high to be negotiating with everyone on the globe. But it is true. And there we go. So basically, this is what I just all said. Is on slide 21. Coase isn't a bad guy. He's not the enemy here. It's just, it doesn't apply to all situations. And it certainly doesn't apply here. Okay. I'm going to pause here for a second. So what we see here then is, again, with the general idea that we do need some government intervention, generally speaking, when we have these externalities. These are just three kinds that we generally will see with a negative externality. Most commonly, we see taxation to discourage use. Governments like to do the taxation because it also then generates revenue for them. Cigarettes being a perfect example, right? That the cigarette taxes for here in, if we just take a general, that if we look at this by state, we're going to probably see here that North Carolina, for instance, where they grow tobacco, it's going to be not going to be a lot of taxes. And we're generally correct here. North Carolina, 536, cigarette tax of just 45 cents, 48th in the country. Hawaii, a pack of cigarettes being $9.44 with a $3.20 cigarette tax. New York being among the most expensive, $4.35. Oregon's actually, I guess you guys don't mind cigarette. Oh no, sorry. Still number 7. So that's actually still almost a 50% tax. So the tax itself, right? District of Columbia $450, Connecticut $435, New York State $435. this would be how we discourage use, right? By imposing these kinds of taxes. The other ones we see are what are called these kind of like sugar taxes, where buying a big soda could be more expensive. Um, just because of, now I'm curious, where is it? Oh, yeah, Missouri. Oh, yeah. Oh, that reminds me. So, Missouri, where it's the cheapest, 17 cents, it's right on the border with Illinois, where the tax is um, really high. Sorry, it's not sure why. $2.98. So you have a state on 17 cents bordering a state where it's $2.98. So there were these signs that I would see when I was driving from one state to the other. I'm not going to find it now if I'm trying to find it quickly here. Oh yeah, here it is. It says basically like stop, don't bootleg cigarettes, don't take them across state lines. So the other ways to do this would be subsidies to encourage use. Where do we see this? I mean, we do see this right now happening with electric cars. That right, you get like a $7,500 tax credit if you buy an electric car, which is reducing the price of electric cars to bring them in line with regular cars. We also see this with like if you were going to install solar panels or that kind of thing in your house. Usually there's tax credits and whatnot, subsidies basically to encourage people to install solar panels. And then the third and final way would be is that we see regulations. To go back to the example of the smoke detector, if you live in an apartment, usually it's something that's required by the city or the county that all apartments have to have like a smoke detector in each unit. Businesses have to have smoke detectors, or fire alarm system. So these are kinds of things that we try to control for the negative externality in these kinds of ways. What we see here again is that these taxes and subsidies are used the most to we try to measure how much of an externality there is, and then we try to impose that tax to cover it. So we call these Pigouvian taxes, named after A.C. Pigou, who I also think was at University of Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just curious here. Oh no, sorry. He was at Cambridge. He must have spent some time. Interesting. Okay, sorry. So Pigouvian taxes, again, these are what we typically see. Again, the cigarette tax is being a perfect example of a Pigouvian tax where we internalize the negative externality that we think exists from the consumption of tobacco, or the consumption of cigarettes. And that's essentially what's happening here. Now, the problem that we see is why is it in Missouri that it's only a 17-cent correction, and that in a state like Oregon or New York, it's a $3 amount. See, now here's where we start to get these problems, right? Is that these are politicians, most likely, that are deciding the amount of the tax. And in Missouri, I don't know what's going on, right? But they, for whatever reason, I don't know if they're exactly estimating the damage that's being caused, the marginal damage, because I don't think that the damage caused by cigarettes is as low as 17 cents. Yet for some reason in Missouri, that's what it is. Nor, on the other hand, do I think that smoking cigarettes is as bad as $3 a pack. I'm not sure that it's that high. it would be helpful as an economist, I think, if we actually knew what this amount was and we just made that consistently the cost across the country. If we go back to that map, let's look at it this way. What we can see is that it's generally less, um, generally less in Republican states, and generally more in more Democrat blue states. And so there's probably a bit more politics related to it than anything. Missouri being a state that's much more Republican than Illinois, for instance. Okay. The other kinds of uh, externalities Pigouvian subsidies and taxes, in this case, taxes being used, are these congestion taxes. London is going back to having them after COVID again. New York City is actually going back to having has them again, and New Jersey is not happy about that because in this case, people live in New Jersey and work in New York. Um, what is it designed to do? It's designed to discourage people from driving their own car. So it's an extra tax for causing congestion. As opposed to causing global warming, here we're saying that you're just stop driving so much because it's difficult for anyone to do anything when the streets are all blocked with cars. Now again, it works in the opposite direction as well. So we can have these subsidies for different things. And again, the ideal method here would be we'd measure the amount of the subsidy and then we push it out. They're going to have an example here, Operation Warp Speed, this whole thing with we wanted this vaccine to be developed quickly, so we provided a subsidy for the creation of the vaccine, and we got one really quick, as you would expect when um, there's that kind of subsidy. This is a pretty good example. I wouldn't have immediately thought of that. The one I was more thinking of, which now directly applies back to you, would be um, that for you all, how much state funding is there from the legislature versus how much you're paying in tuition. The idea here being that all state universities, mine, the University of Hawaii, but then also, right, like Eastern Oregon, gets money from the state, and to the extent that it gets money from the state from its general funds, that covers part of the cost of doing business, which then means that less money is needed from tuition. I'm just trying to see here. It's not immediately clear here to me. Let's look at this one. This is coming from 2021. So here, so I'm just trying to read this really quick here. But the idea, I don't really need to read it too much here, but here the idea would be is that the state government would subsidize um, your college education to some extent so that you don't have to pay as much in tuition, with the idea being that a college educated person is going to pay more in taxes over their lifetime, they're less likely to commit crimes, all of these positive benefits, this positive externality that comes from being college educated. Probably the more difficult way to do all this, again, if you have these externalities exist, would be these regulations. People just don't like regulations. we use them probably the most with environmental, um, with the environment. But again, that's probably why global warming regulations are so opposed. It just sounds so forceful, right? Taxes, at least people respond with free choice in whether they want to pay the tax or not. And I'm certain there are people out there in the world who stop smoking because they say it's too expensive, and it's too expensive because um, the taxes are so high. But then what's interesting, and this is kind of another part of the debate, if you find this kind of thing interesting, the same taxation that's imposed on cigarettes isn't imposed all at the same time on vaping. So now youngsters, I sound like an old man, but youngsters these days are going to vaping rather than cigarette smoking. And so all we do here with a regulation is that once we impose that amount, so we pick the amount now, is that now the curve itself is horizontal. We still get the amount that we're supposed to get, right? We just did it in a different way. And again, what you can do is you can regulate it. If we compare the taxation issue versus the quantity regulation issue, the net result is the same. The result is the same in that we get the same quantity. It's just that most of the time that the easiest thing to do is to establish a tax, because you're going to get it paid for. You're going to be able to buy other things that you need with the tax money. And most of the time, um, it's easier to you don't need to have as much information to be able to um, set the tax and still stop people from doing some things. If you set the quantity, you need to have much more deeper information about the shape of the marginal cost curve. And so we can kind of see these things here, even with just different firm sizes, the problems we'd run into if we did a regulation versus a tax. And so here we go. So here's our, right, in our situation here where we had three different companies and we're trying to determine how much pollution, what kind of steps we should do to reduce pollution. Again, here would be our three options. We could regulate those companies and force them to do certain things in terms of the quantity. We could also, though, just impose the tax, and the tax would just be based on just how big they are and how much stuff they're producing. But again, the net result is going to be the same. And that's essentially what's said here. So I'm just going to skip over this part here. Not that it's not important, just I worry about this lecture becoming a bit too long here. Again, what we tend to see in almost all situations, more so than regulation, is we see the taxation. And the taxation um, allows us to know less and still reduce the extent of the externality. And again, the tax also then provides the revenue that most of the time people in government like, because then they can use it to, form education, do other things. A lot of states use the tax revenue they get from taxing cigarettes to do anti-smoking campaigns, or here in Hawaii, we use it actually to help fund the university with taxes from cigarettes. Okay, that kind of concludes everything here. More that I want to say. Okay, I'm just going to end it here because I just wanted to keep this to about an hour.